So good day, everyone. Welcome to our discussion panel today, the challenges of the modern web and getting ahead. A little bit about the format of the webinar this morning. We're going to go through some introductions. We have a great diagram to share with you guys, and we'll get into some discussion and Q&A at the end. So please ask your questions at the end. There's a little button down there that says ask a question. Go ahead and fill that in if anything comes to mind as we continue the discussion. And then as a reminder, this is all part of the Mock Information Festival. So it's from zero to Mock in 4 weeks. And there's lots of great sessions coming up if you want to go check out the Mock Alliance website to get some more information on that. So for introductions this morning, we have Ishan Anand, co-founder and CTO of Layer Zero, Matt Gould, client director of E2X, Lisa Crenshaw, solutions architect at Fastly, Philip Rakowski, CTO at Vue Storefront, and myself, Mahaila Mazenga, CTO and Mock Alliance ambassador. We've prepared this diagram for you guys this morning to kind of take you through a high level of what this type of modern web solution even looks like. And I'd like to invite Ishan to kick that off for us.
Yeah, sure. So, what this nicely does is it kind of breaks down the three key areas that you need to think about, which is your infrastructure, your application code, and then your team and your developers. So let's start at the top row with the infrastructure and the way those pieces get plugged together. So you have your users who typically will be browsing the site through a web browser. And then the first piece they're going to interact with in this kind of architecture is a CDN. And the CDN layer, provides a number of key functionalities. The most important one is probably performance. But it's also where you're going to be wanting to be able to have edge logic being executed to accomplish a couple key things, things like cache key normalization, as well as the ability to what we sometimes call at Layer Zero progressively migrate. So especially if you're coming from a traditional monolithic architecture, it's going to feel, very scary and a lot of risk to completely rip out your entire stack and then put this new stack in place. And the CDN becomes a very important leverage point that lets you route the traffic, depending on if that part of the site has been migrated or not, to the monolithic or the modern version of your stack. And we've had a lot of customers use, our platform to do that, and they've had a lot of success, incrementally migrating the site. So they might start with, say, very common, the path to product flow, we often call it. So the home page, the category page, and the product detail page might all be on the modern stack. And then you might bring the checkout and the cart process can stay on the older stack, later on. And that's actually a really good way to kind of get started. And the CDN is a really important linchpin for allowing you to do that and be able to route the traffic appropriately. So that's some examples of things you can do on the edge that are really, really important. Make sure when you pick a solution, you're able to do that kind of routing. Then after requests go through the CDN, the next key thing they're going to hit is, some form of what's sometimes called a backend for the front end or a serverless tier. And the goal here is really twofold. The first is you need something that will take your backend APIs and orchestrate and aggregate them in such a way that they're consumable for the browser front end code. In a much more efficient and performant manner. But also the other key thing this backend for the front end will do is you want to be able to support something called server-side rendering. And that's where the entire HTML output of the page, even though it's defined by JavaScript, typically in a modern stack, gets rendered out in this serverless tier and sent to the browser. And that allows the page to be shown immediately to the user without having to execute a lot of JavaScript. So it's actually really important for performance, in addition to having the CDN, is that you've got some tier that's doing this server-side rendering. And then finally, you've got your existing services. So that could be your e-com platform, whatever your payment services are, and your CMS. And again, your backend for the front end or that serverless backend tier is going to be stitching all those together into a unified experience that's being sent to your users. So that's really the top row and how those things fit together. The next layer below that is really thinking about your application code. And there's really two categories here. The first is probably your existing backend services code. So that's the code that controls, say, your payment platform or your e-commerce platform. And then there's the web framework. And web frameworks today, modern frameworks like Vue Storefront, actually are isomorphic. That is, they control and command not just what happens inside the browser, but also what's happening in that serverless backend code. And so what you want to have is some form of what's often referred to as CI/CD, which stands for continuous integration, continuous deployment, sorry. And the role that'll play is it'll take the code from your developers and your source control, and it will then basically render it out and make sure it gets delivered appropriately to all the components in the row above. And these web frameworks are extremely important for developers getting productivity out of the modern stack. They encompass a lot of best practices, so your developers do not have to reinvent the wheel. And when you're building kind of this modern way, it's really important to have that foundation. To kind of illustrate that, Google has an initiative they call Project Aurora, where they really want to make the entire web faster. And they finally realized that rather than just say to developers, here are the metrics that matter, they actually have started going and supporting with either funding or development resources the biggest, most popular web frameworks, because that's the biggest leverage point for best practices. So folks like Google are actually going to each of these frameworks and helping them set up the best practices so you don't have to do it and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So that's really important, so you can build and focus on things that are differentiated rather than having to spend your time on hammers and nails. And then finally, at the bottom row of this is the team. And one of the things that, we often encounter, especially if you're coming from a traditional stack, is you may not have actually the right number of Vue or React developers or Angular developers you're going to eventually need. And that's where folks like E2X and others can come in to help, augment your capabilities. But the way you want to think about this in terms of your team structure is you've got kind of your backend services, and they might be written in, depending on what your backend is, they might be in Java or Ruby or PHP. And your backend developers continue to develop there. But what you've done now with this modern stack is you've carved out a new space for your front-end developer and designer, where they're controlling the front-end experience. And you can have folks who are kind of, shall we say, full stack developers that span both of those areas. But there is a lot in kind of the modern web and modern web tooling that can be harder to pick up, and you sometimes need to make sure that you dedicate having the right team structure to a mix of front end and back end developers. So that's kind of the diagram in a nutshell.
Great. Thank you for that overview. And I want to give everyone else an opportunity to give a little bit of insight on how they feel they play a role in this diagram and what the core of their services also are. And I think, Ishan, you took us a little bit through layer 0. But Lisa, so on Fastly and the CDN, what would you say are the core competencies that you deliver via this type of framework?
So Fastly is one of the modern CDNs. We are in a perfect position to do, as Anand was saying, be able to provide logic at the edge, something like a geolocation. Our POPs are placed around the world. They're closer to your end user. We can do this logic, this processing within the CDN closer to your end user and allow you to make decisions based on those more quickly. Don't go all the way back to the server to discover that the client is coming from a country where you don't want to serve any responses. You can go ahead and block them at the edge. The other thing Ishan mentioned was the CI/CD capabilities. We at Fastly believe that strongly. So all of our work can be done. You can push up changes to Fastly code. You can purge any of the assets we're storing on Fastly through API calls. So we're definitely positioned to be in this CI/CD first modern structure.
Right. And for anyone out there that might not know what a POP is, can you explain that to them?
I'm sorry. Yeah, POP is a point of presence, and it just means a big conglomeration of servers that do what we need them to do.
Great. Thank you. And then Philip, from the Vue storefront aspect, what is your game to play in this type of solution?
Yes, so Vue Storefront is bodiless frontend, which communicates with all the backend services through APIs. And because of that, you're having this flexibility of using different services while still keeping the same frontend solution, whatever you will use. And Vue Storefront itself is based on Next.js. And Next.js is a framework on top of Vue.js, and this is also allowing you to make use of features that we'll heavily discuss today, like SFG, basically JAMstack, and using the edge. And Vue Storefront itself, it is allowing you to build this well-performing frontends by delivering, ready-to-use integrations, a standardized way of combining each of those on the front end. And also we're giving you a library of front-end components called Storefront UI, which is also helping you a little bit with performance, but also adding all the accessibility out of the box.
Right, and as Ishan mentioned, I'm sure keeping on top of all of the changing standards.
Yeah.
So Matt, from your perspective, as far as assembling a solution like this with so many great vendors, what is your experience with that?
Sure. So, E2X, we're technically, we call ourselves a technical agency. I think in old money, a systems integrator. Now, ultimately, we look to lever the changes in the technology landscape for the benefit of our clients, and that's what our job is. So, certainly when we've been working with these much more kind of modern, JAMstack and Mac type applications and frameworks, we see kind of a multitude of benefits there, both for us as a business, but also for the clients that we work with and for whom we have to add value. So sort of summarize those, I kind of, it's interesting hearing the introductions there. Key is always speed to market with changes. And there's two ways of looking at speed to market. So one is the time that it takes you to go from zero to having, tooling set up and the ability, as was pointed out at the beginning, to have your, smart developers adding value to the customer. Right, so adding business value rather than spending time setting up tooling and infrastructure and so on, and that's really important. So you get up and running with these new technologies fast, and that's important. And then once you're up and running, because you haven't spent months and months having to build out the new perfect infrastructure, you can actually start developing in anger and adding new functions, new things for the customer. And again, with these, this kind of modern architecture, the time it takes you to actually to do that development and get your code live is way faster than perhaps with some of the older sort of monolithic type frameworks, architectures, and applications. Right, so there's a double benefit in that kind of speed to market area. The second thing I'm going to point out, and again that has been touched on, is the importance of knowledge and talent. So it's we all want to be, you want to be attracting the, smart young people, well, not just young people, so smart people of all ages, but who are, interested and motivated to use, great technology to do great things. And that's really important. And when you look at this architecture, what you see is that, that writ large, this is where, people who are ambitious and really good coders, this is where they want to be. And that's important, because that helps you to, both retain and hire the best people. And that's really important. So that's two of the key things that we see, and for us as a business is really important, and for the clients that we work with. And the final thing, and again, this has been touched on, is the actual speed and performance of the platforms and the technologies that you build. And of course, recently the emergence of Core Web Vitals and other metrics that can affect how a website is actually rated from a search engine perspective. Speed is absolutely key, and so again, we as a technical agency are often our clients will look to us to help give sound advice and counsel about how they really get the most, how they get the best possible experience for the customer. And of course, SEO is a core aspect of that. So those are the areas that we as a technical agency are really why we love this type of architecture and the tooling that's represented here.
Great overview. And fast sites are super, super important. So you mentioned speed to market. Why else should retailers be thinking about JAMstack and Edge Cloud platforms, for anyone that wants to answer that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Actually, there's a couple things. There's first, very fast sites. And for me, the hallmark of a JAMstack site is one that, maximally uses the CDN. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do, what you might have heard as a classic static build times. But the key thing is that as much as possible, the data is being served from the edge, as Lisa was talking about, which is really important for performance. And by edge, I'm also referring to the CDN. And so when you do that, you get the fastest possible sites. And as Matt mentioned, in now this new era starting in June of Core Web Vitals, speed no longer just means better conversion rate of your existing traffic. It literally means new organic traffic that you're probably stealing actually from your competition, because search engine ranking can be a little bit of zero sum. So now speed is both revenue and growth. So it's extremely important. And the JAMstack approach gives you the best possible shot at getting a great speed. Matt also mentioned, velocity. I think the productivity benefit is really, really important. And to understand why that happens, it's helpful to think about it this way. You've got, a very abstract stack that is, front end code, back end code, your database. And as you go further down that stack, it takes a lot more work to iterate. Changing HTML can be really quick, but very impactful. We've all heard those A/B tests where they change a button and suddenly conversion rate goes up. And as you go down, say doing a database migration, you do that very carefully. And so each of these layers have their own ability to iterate at different speeds. And when you create this JAMstack-like solution, what you're basically doing is you're giving that front end space the ability to move as fast as it possibly can. And that really unlocks a lot of agility, especially if you've got dedicated front-end development teams. And that's why it's really important to kind of have the top of that bottom row kind of allocated out. So it's not just good enough to have a full stack developer. You need to make sure or you've got a front-end developer who has time to iterate, as well as work with the product team to make sure you're getting the best possible experience for your users. And then, something that Matt also touched on, which should not be ignored, is the recruiting angle. This is, for lack of a better word, the modern stack. It's also the one that, the sharpest developers are most interested in developing on. And so it can be a really critical thing for recruiting to have a stack that developers are really interested in developing on. And that's very, very important.
And just to clarify, is there a misconception about JAMstack itself, static versus dynamic? What's the ideal solution that this should be applied to?
I don't know if misconception is the right word. I would say there's a debate right now in the JAMstack space. In fact, we just hosted on a podcast that I'm part of called JavaScript Jam, a debate on what is the definition of JAMstack now. Basically, what's happened over the last 12 months is the ecosystem has slowly migrated from a pure static approach to incorporating a series of technologies that are more dynamic in nature, whether it's, server-side rendering, which, Vue Storefront supports, or static site generation, which again, Vue Storefront supports. There's also variations in between, which I expect we'll be seeing coming to a lot of frameworks. They go by the name like incremental static generation, or parallel static generation, or there's now called distributed persistent rendering. The key thing to know about all these different terms is there are ways to solve this problem that JAMstack has historically had, which is when it was first conceived, in order to maximally use the CDN, what they did is they forced you to write your page such that it was entirely static, as if there was no database. And that's a bit of a Jedi mind trick that forces the developer to write their page such that the CDN can just serve it up immediately. So let me make that really concrete. In a traditional e-commerce site, somebody lands on the page, they've got something like a cart count, and it says, "Welcome back, Bob." And all of that requires a server call to happen. And so what you need to make sure is when you generate that page, you do it in such a way that all that information is late loaded so that the CDN can serve up that page with those areas effectively blank, like the cart count. And then JavaScript on the page figures out your cart count rather than having your server have to do it and put it into a template that then just gets served up to the user. And so the end result of this was they went to a very static approach, which means that when you deploy your site, every single one of your pages has to be built. And if you've got, more than 1,000, more than 10,000 pages, that creates a lot of friction. And so for folks that were doing more than, say, 10,000 pages in an e-commerce site, that wasn't workable. And so you needed these more modern techniques that used server-side rendering, which again, Vue Storefront supports, and Layer 0 supports as well with that serverless backend. And that's kind of the thing that's forced kind of that debate about what is JAMstack or not.
Okay. So in my opinion, this is a particular type of assembly, a really powerful assembly. And who do you believe it's worth implementing this type of solution for, and who is it not? Philip, how about you?
That's an excellent question, and I think it's on the very high level. I think JAMstack is worth implementing for everyone. I mean, the benefits are not scoped to any type of a specific customer, and they're not scoped to any type of specific website. Of course, if you're having a large scale e-commerce, probably you will benefit more, especially, when we are talking about the performance, especially when we are talking about the cost of infrastructure. But really, this is just a pattern that is emerging right now, and it turns out to be much more optimized for performance and resources. So I think this is something that anyone should look into. And also, the whole modern architecture these days, it's being implemented mostly to give more freedom and to increase velocity of implementing certain features and iterating. So, any type of project will benefit on this on multiple levels.
Matt, what about you? You're working with a lot of clients in this space. Where are you seeing, the best synergy?
So, I think that I think any business that is, going down a kind of headless, true headless and service-oriented route will benefit from this technology. Okay, I know that headless as a concept has been around for a while now, but I think it's only in the last 5 years or so that we really see both application vendors and technology vendors and frameworks that really kind of deliver on the promise. I think that we've all been keen to see the rise of the Mac Alliance in itself show it's tantamount to that, and indeed the movement, if you like, that is JAMstack. So I'd agree with the last comment that it's for everyone, right? I mean, I think everyone at scale, without a doubt. Again, obviously, technologies like Vue are great because they kind of massively help to kind of simplify and accelerate the uptake in some of these technologies. But on the other hand, they are, they do come with some technical requirements in terms of knowledge and confidence to operate these technologies when they're live, right? So I do think there are some businesses who perhaps don't necessarily have the maturity in their IT organization to take this on, from the get-go. However, I would still advise them to look at it, right? I mean, the advantage of working with agencies like ourselves and others in the Mac space and beyond, and who work with these technologies, is that they'll, if they should be willing to take the operational side of a business on a journey as well, right? And that's to make sure that as you adopt these new technologies, that your business can be successful with them. So I would advise those that look at this and go, well, it looks really interesting, but it's not really for us. Engage with your friendly, integration, partner, and engage with the vendors, engage with the amazing kind of partnership ecosystem that now exists within JAMstack and the Mac. What's great about that ecosystem is the openness and the collaboration that happens there, right? I think for those of us who've been in the working in this space for decades, is something that we love, right? And that didn't exist in the past in the same way. So make use of that. Learn about the advantages, learn about how other people have taken on the operational change piece that comes with this. What does it mean for your target operating model? Have those conversations. You'd be surprised at the openness and willingness of people to share the stories, the successes, the challenges, so that you can make that informed decision as to whether this is really for you. I don't. In principle, I think most businesses of any size can benefit from these technologies.
I want to jump in and follow up. I think to the audience, it might seem, a bit amazing that we're all in support of this architecture, and it would, seem, may not seem as credible, but I really actually believe this form of development is actually going to take over and become the predominant form. And that's not just all of us here on the panel. Tom Preston Warner, maybe folks know the name, he's the co-founder of GitHub. He made the prediction. He said, within 5 years, your next large-scale, fully featured web app is going to be built with the JAMstack. So it really is a sea change. If you want to get specific where it doesn't apply, I would say websites where, you are not differentiating based on the quality of your digital customer experience, then you don't need that ability to kind of iterate really fast, or where speed does not translate into revenue. And there are some sites out there where maybe those two requirements hold, in which case it may not be as big a priority. But if either of those two matter to you, then this is definitely something you should take a look at.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. This is, from my perspective, it's all truly about scale at the end of the day, right? Because even on current monoliths, could you continue to putz along if you don't have any site issues, et cetera, and you're okay with the scale? Sure. But there comes a really critical point where the systems just no longer can handle it. So as far as winning budget and approval for migrating to a modern stack, and Matt, I'll invite you to say a word on this, but I think I'd like to say one myself, and that is, the idea of winning budget and the way that you approach that has to be really holistic and internal. So as we talk about, what is the right applicability of this type of solution, what type of retailers does it apply to? I think you do need to look internally and say, what issues do we have, right? And as Ishan mentioned, is there a speed to revenue issue? Does conversion matter? Does scale matter? Does speed matter? Does our ability to iterate fast matter? And if your answer is no to all of those, then this is a large undertaking, right? Especially without an SI. So I think you have to define your problems first before saying, well, let's just move to this great modern stack because everybody else is doing it. That's certainly not the right way to go about it, and not the right way for it to be presented to win the budget. But I guarantee that there are a lot of businesses out there right now that have real issues, with scale, that have real issues with deployments and their staff and the ability to get these solutions off the ground. So in these cases, you have to look internally and you have to define your problem solution set.
Yeah, I'd echo that. And sometimes it's those aren't straightforward questions to raise or to answer, quite frankly. We would always encourage and work with clients to think about total cost of ownership, but to take quite a deep view of that, right? So not just, I'm replacing application A with, architecture B, and therefore it's not always a kind of such an apples to apples consideration and the cost of ownership. Do think about the cost of the people that it takes to service, the technology that you're on. Do think about the importance of, the talent question, right? Retaining and growing talent, right? Having to, losing people because your technology is old and difficult to work with and slow and that's expensive as well, right? So sometimes there's the cost of staying on the architecture that you're using, can be pretty considerable as well, right? So I think it's important to absolutely to take that kind of holistic view when you're making the business case. But also, it's interesting. The point was made earlier about is this technology right for everyone? And I couldn't agree more that if you don't need to differentiate in terms of your customer experience, then perhaps you don't need that agility. But I'd be amazed if any business out there could hand on heart truly say that they don't worry about their competitors, or indeed the ability to have kind of true operational and agility, for that to be a differentiator for them, to remain competitive, right? And so again, I think kind of encouraging people to think beyond just the technology and look at their whole business and look at what their competitors are doing. Is really important here. If you look at the best aspirational businesses in the world, they embrace some of these types of technologies some time ago, right? And that's what's helped them be brilliant. And I challenge any business owner, to tell me that they don't really, they don't want to be brilliant, right? And so you need to look at how you do things and the tools that you do it with and the people that you employ to make the magic happen. All of that is part of being brilliant, and that's why it's so important to look at take a holistic view of operations.
Yeah. So making the magic happen, then what does the customer need to think about when considering switching to modern web characteristics? Lisa, how about you?
Yeah, I would strongly suggest have some way of observing the state of the union now and in future, before the switch, after the switch. You really need to be able to see what speeds you're at right now, and if to what locations. And then you want to see when you make changes incrementally, are those speeds doing what you want? And you can do this with ways of mimicking traffic behavior, like a catch point test or a web page test. Or you can use a modern CDN that gives you real-time logging. So that's all of the data from every request coming in, every response going out. There's a lot of information that could be there. And I'm sure you have someone in your company who's a stats nerd and really wants to get into that level of data. And that can help do a proof of concept and prove your case that it's the right thing to do for your company.
One thing I want to just add on to that in terms of logging metrics, we've talked a lot about speed. There's a technology called real user monitoring, which looks at the speed of your site as judged by users who actually browse it. It's the same kind of technology that Google's using to create Core Web Vitals. So we have a free tool that you can just toss onto your site with just a tag manager, and you can get a look at how your Core Web Vitals basically are doing. And looking at that, as Lisa was mentioning, before and after, would be a great way to make sure you're instrumenting the right things.
Yeah, lots of great and available tools to layer on top, and I agree. Logging is really critical on the before and after to get the picture. So for companies that are currently on a traditional monolithic e-commerce system, what are some of the approaches that they can take for migration? Philip, you want to start off?
Yeah. So we saw a lot of examples of people doing this, and I think like the most important thing to mention here is that if you are using a monolithic platform right now, you don't need really to throw everything out and start from scratch. You can migrate to modern tech stack progressively. So when we are talking about moving to the modern tech stack, we mean that instead of having a single monolithic platform that takes care of all your front end, back end, and the back end product catalog, orders, content, etc., each of those is delivered by a separate vendor. So let's assume you're currently using just Magento for your e-commerce store. And the first step you can take if you want to migrate to a modern tech stack but while still keeping Magento is detaching your front end from Magento. And you can use tools obviously such as Vue Storefront for that, or you can use PW Studio, which is dedicated only to Magento. There's really like a lot of options to choose from. And having front-end detached from the backend is already giving you a lot of benefits because you can already make use of all the things that we're discussing here today, like JAMstack, delivering your site from the edge, lowering the cost of infrastructure, etc. And the front-end will communicate with your backend through API. And this is giving you even more flexibility because it allows you to choose technologies specialized in different areas. So let's say Magento out-of-the-box CMS, I think it's still page builder, but I might be wrong. It's no longer satisfying your needs in terms of managing the content. Then you just no longer use it and connect via API to any modern CMS like, Contentful, Storyblock, Content Stack, Compliance. And, the same way you're moving to other services over time, they're replacing different functionalities that back then were delivered by Magento. And at some point, Magento is taking care only of a subset of your shop functionalities. So that's like the most common scenario. But there's also another scenario. So let's say you already have your monolithic application and you don't want to move progressively. You already know what is your dream tech stack, modern tech stack, and you just want to move there. But, starting from scratch and maintaining the old website while building a new one in parallel, this is usually not a good decision because there's a lot of issues in that. You have to take care of synchronization, and you're basically, maintaining a lot of redundant code, and you can migrate your users very, very late, only when the new modern tech stack is ready. So what you can do is actually this is a case for one of our clients. You can also replace your website page by page. So let's say you have this old Magento store and our client is migrating to Commerce Tools and Storyblock. So what they are doing is they're building certain pages in this modern tech stack. And once they are ready, they are replacing them for their users. So part of the shop is delivered by Magento, part of the shop is delivered by Vue Storefront, Commerce Tools, and Storyblock. Of course, this needs a lot of orchestration, but the end goal is that your users are progressively getting the benefits of better performance, and you no longer need to maintain the pages that you already have built with the modern stack. So these are like the two approaches that we are seeing, and really only detaching your front end is enough to benefit from most of the things that we're discussing here.
I mean, there are other strengths, there are other migration patterns that we see commonly. I mean, the other one that's quite common would be a geographical migration. So you're a company who's trading in, 10, 12 countries. You choose one, you build your new platform, you test it there. And what's interesting, and again, as we just heard, that if you go purely headless, obviously that allows you then, as a step one to then start, gives you some flexibility about what you do underneath that API, and which is a massive de-risking, another way of de-risking a migration. The other thing is, and again, we just heard about that, is the way we would describe that is a functional migration. So you look for, go page for page across the website, and again, a very commonly seen, pattern within a migration or re-platform maneuver. I mean, the other one is, of course, a big bang, right? And I think it's still, people still do it, right? I mean, it's the riskiest approach, but it's still practiced. For businesses that are trading in one country that don't necessarily have the benefit of that, the kind of geographical approach to a migration, or perhaps they're on a burning platform, and maybe they're losing so many customers and hemorrhaging revenue as a result of the state of the platform. Then sometimes the risk of a big bang may may still be worth taking, but it would certainly be the last choice that I would look at. And certainly when we advise and work with our customers to help plan, a migration process and indeed the kind of target operating model move that often goes with it. We'll take them through, all of the different options, and risk assess those against the particulars of that business. And that's important, right? There isn't one size fits all for this. You need to look at the particulars of a business and indeed the problems, that they're trying to solve. And that will determine the best approach to a migration.
I love to hear you say that, because that is what I do all day, every day as a solutions architect here at Fastly. Because as Sean mentioned, I think in the introduction, one of the things Fastly does really well is we call it load balancing, but it's more traffic management, traffic direction. So we can examine the path, do a URL-based, a page-based, as Philip mentioned, migration to the new stack. And then, of course, you get your real-time metrics, just make sure everything's working well. But I have helped frequently many customers do a big bang change, and you got to hold their hands, and it works well. And you got to use that logging.
I'll just add to that. Actually, the 0th step is put a edge or CDN in front of your stack.
Yes.
Make sure it's one that can do the edge logic Lisa and I have been talking about, so that you can route appropriately. And just put it in front of your existing stack, because you need something that is going to be that router, so that you can handle this migration, even if it's big bang. It'll let you roll back, and it'll let you flip the switch in a way that's going to be a lot less painless. And you might find you're actually going to be able to get speed out of your existing stack. You might be able to squeeze a little additional performance benefit before you actually migrate over to JAMstack as well.
Totally agree.
I mean, I think that, what's great is that again, because of the flexibility of the architectural options that are now, commonplace, is there's never been more options for risk mitigation. When you look at, and I think that last example there of how, once you get a really good example of Fastly as a potential first step, is that you then, you start seeing, you start fixing some of those issues, from day one, that perhaps driving the need to move quickly, right? So again, the opportunity for risk mitigation, both in terms of solving immediate problems, but also how you plan a migration, pretty rich, right? And so I do advise people to make use of, the amazing, technology that's out there, but engage with people within these businesses and get their advice, right? I mean, hear those stories about how how those processes, how those migration and operational change processes have been managed, and how how vendors engage, often at a really deep level now, to help customers on those journeys. There's a lot of great experience, and and you can learn so much by talking about how different businesses have made that move.
I just want to highlight two areas that you should look at when you're planning out this migration. Is first, look at the number of pages you have on your site, number of products or SKUs, because if you have a large number of them, say greater than 1,000, greater than 10,000, it's going to restrict your, definitely restrict your options, and definitely make sure you're choosing solutions that are compatible with, server-side rendering rather than a pure static approach. The other thing you should take a look at is, what are your non-technical stakeholders using for authoring and editing? Because one thing that isn't, diagrammed out here is what your non-developers are doing and how they're actually making changes and how those get propagated and cleared from the cache appropriately. And so you might need to have a webhook or something similar pieced together to make sure that, they have the ability to edit and preview, and then actually push changes live to content, and then has to go through these different layers that you see in the diagram and make sure they all get updated appropriately. So make sure you think through that workflow so that it's as productive for the non-technical stakeholders as well.
Yeah, that's really important. And often, what's great in there's some really excellent UX people around these days. Ask them to look at the operational considerations as well as the customer considerations. You get great insight that way.
And what's great is that in my experience, all these tools do have interconnectivity between each other, at least generically, and you are able to facilitate those communications and keep things in sync and allow those business tools to talk back to the cache clear. So I love cache, by the way, and being able to utilize it for speed. And so, Lisa, how can an edge platform or CDN cache API results when those things change all the time? I think this is an area that people just don't understand easily.
Yeah, and we actually mentioned those two phrases earlier in our chat, dynamic and static. Here at Fastly, we believe that there's a third kind of content. We call it event-driven. So something purely dynamic, it could change at any time. No one knows when it's going to change. But something event-driven, like I have clicked to add another t-shirt to my shopping cart. I clicked a thing. That's an event. You can catch that. You can purge that counter if you need to. So the number of items in my cart is static until it changes. So a given storefront, they have 32 stores all around Washington State, where I am. Once they move into Oregon State, neighboring state, their list of stores is going to change. Doesn't change every day, doesn't change every month, doesn't change on a regular basis. But when it changes, you want to purge that content that we have on our CDN. With event-driven content, it all comes down to that instant purge, that immediate revalidation, where your CDN forgets what it knows, it goes and pulls a fresh copy of that piece of data. We do a lot of API calls. When you're serving out an API, that's the perfect time for event-driven content, because when the data behind that is changed in your database, you can push a purge message to Fastly. We'll forget what we have and go get a fresh copy.
So what's the difference? Because we have client side, we have origin, we have edge, we have all these places where we can put logic.
There's a lot. Yeah.
Why should you put logic at the edge?
Logic at the edge, because anything at clients is out of your control. You can't access that. If it's cached on your client side, you can no longer get to that data and change it. So what we suggest at Fastly is cache it all on the CDN, and then let the clients, whether that's an API request, whether that's someone in a browser, an app on your phone, make that request to the edge, to the CDN, to get that fresh piece of content. And if it's at the CDN, you've got you as the storefront owner, let's say, you have access to be able to purge that, to refresh it, to serve stale if your origin is having some troubles. You have more full control over that at the edge. And then again, why you would put it at the edge and not at your origin? Because we're closer to the end user. And there's a number of things we can do with content stitching. Fastly's moving into more logic at the edge. We've always had it, but now we're really digging into the fun things that you can do with it. So we can pull a piece of content like a GraphQL response, a piece from edge, a piece fresh from your origin, stitch it together, return that to the client as needed.
The general guideline I'll add to that is the more specific something is to the user, the closer you should move it to them, with the caveat that when you move it to the client, there's a performance issue. So the next best place that's close to them, if it's very specific to that user, is typically the edge. So let me break it down as an example where you don't want to push something to the edge. So server-side rendering, where you build that entire HTML version of the page from your JavaScript, you don't want to do that actually at every single one of the edge nodes, because now if you've got 60, 70 pops, each of those are going to build their own version of it. And if the page is fairly generic to every user, it's the same product description, same category page, then do that at the origin, and then at all those cache, build it once, do the CPU processing on that backend for the front end, send it out to the cache. And then as an example, something that should be happening at the edge is personalization of that content. So personalization of the content, the stitching that Lisa was talking about, take the server-side rendered one from the origin, stitch it together with something personal to the user, and then serve that from the edge. And that's kind of where you should use the best of both worlds to kind of send it to the device.
Yeah, I need to plug. I'm an old Perl programmer from back in the day, and my favorite thing is there's more than one way to do it. So there's more than one way to do it, and you can tell there's a lot of folks who are around to help you out with that if you'd like.
It's funny how Perl does that. So you mentioned origin having problems, and I think that's something that isn't talked about often is resiliency. So when your origin does have problems, can one of you tell me how this solution really helps protect the site from those origin problems, and how much buffer there truly is for organizations out there in their resiliency plans to use this as part of that?
Well, I feel like I'm hogging the mic, but I'll just put in my quick pitch of what we do is help customers build failovers in multiple origins. That has its downsides with the synchronicity of origins. There's always the classic serve it stale if it's static. A few things we can do on the CDN side, but I'm looking forward to hearing some other thoughts there.
Yeah, I also felt like I was hogging, but I'd basically say one thing to keep in mind is that default, very similar to what Lisa was saying, is because with this JAMstack first architecture, or CDN first architecture in the JAMstack, the fact that those points of presence, those edge nodes, are absorbing the traffic actually can help your resiliency, because the origin may get a lot less traffic now with it in front of it. And so that actually not just improves resiliency, but also can improve your cost structure.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
so,
and also where sorry, just one final point on that, which is where we talk about the transition, the monolith to modern architecture transition, and your content is potentially, during that transitional period, you have data flowing from an old, potentially from an old on-premise monolith solution, as well as, parts of your 2B architecture, which are, super fast, SaaS, cloud engineered applications, right? And you want to make sure that the customer doesn't have a really horrendous experience. And again, that's why you don't want to be going to origin, particularly on your older technology. So you get a much more kind of equal customer experience when you're managing the customer journey, where where realistically that's being served by some older tech alongside some newer tech at the same time.
So we have a question here from the audience. Of course, while we're on the topic of the modern web and site speed, so what is the bar we should be targeting with a new e-commerce stack?
So the best baseline bar is to use Core Web Vitals, because that's what Google uses. And making sure that you pass those metrics, because that's really where, speed equals organic traffic. So there are 3 metrics in Core Web Vitals. One called largest contentful paint, which is how quickly the image shows up. And the threshold for that is within 2.5 seconds for 75% of your users. There's another one called first input delay, and another one which measures how quickly your page responds. And then finally, there's another one called cumulative layout shift, and it's a unitless metric. They have a threshold number of 0.1. Basically, it measures how much your page jumps around when it's loading or when users are interacting with it. And those are the 3 metrics to watch. You might go to Page Speed Insights, and it's going to give you a bunch of data and a bunch of metrics. It'll give you like 6 different metrics that it puts into a performance score. Ignore the performance score at the top. Ignore everything except where it says field data and it says Core Web Vitals, because that's the first thing you need to look at. And then if you've got a problem in one of those areas, then you can look at the other numbers that correlate to Core Web Vitals. That's what to do.
And what is the current actual bar for Google's LCP?
2.5 seconds.
2.5 seconds. So, and that's great performance. And that's, can you explain what a largest contentful paint is for the audience if they don't know, in terms of the render?
Yeah, so you just think about your page and just think about above the fold. what is the largest piece of content and how long does it take for that to show up? So very often in e-commerce, that's your hero image. That's your product image. And so a classic example is your product image on a product description page might be part of a carousel. And so if you're waiting for that carousel's JavaScript to load before that image shows up on the page, you're actually going to have a very bad, largest contentful paint. And so what you need to do is sometimes make sure you prioritize that content and its rendering before, basically the parsing and rendering of JavaScript.
And then past LCP, with such a modern solution like this, with such a fast solution like this, what in your experience do the transition times look like? Are they still 2.5 seconds, or are we aiming for lower than that?
Well, so the great thing about, the modern stack, if you're using a framework like Vue Storefront, for example, that has, what are sometimes called single page app technology built in, those page transitions can be super, super fast. They can be 300 to 400 milliseconds as some of the transitions customers have at least done on our platform. And just to put that in perspective, 300, 400 milliseconds is basically the blink of an eye. So single page apps and this modern stack are really the best shot we have of delivering websites that look and feel like a native app. And that's truly amazing in a sea change. I will note that Core Web Vitals does not track single page apps as well as it could, but Google, we've been talking with Google. They've been taking a lot of developer feedback. They're certainly aware of the problem and they're iterating on it. And just actually over the last 6 months, they fixed a problem with the cumulative layout shift and the way it worked with single page apps. So we expect they're just going to continue to iterate on that, and benefits will accrue better to single page apps over time.
That's good news. So all of this discussion, right, hopefully it leads to business outcomes, right? And what are some of the business outcomes that we can expect as a result of a site with better front-end performance?
Well, maybe I will take that at least partially. So, overall, when we are talking about the performance these days, we are talking about so-called user-centric metrics, which are obviously centered around users and their experience of the website. So if the users are getting better experience of the website, you can expect much less bounce rates, which usually leads to a better conversion. That's the first thing. The second thing is, especially on the large scale, you can count on much lower cost of the infrastructure. I think one of the key benefits of JAMstack in terms of cost is the fact that your infrastructure could really be very cheap. So that would be, I think, the two main things that you could expect from better performance on the website.
I'll add to that. So as Philip mentioned, better bounce and decrease in cost will be important ones. Better conversion rate. There's countless studies on faster site, better revenue. I mentioned already as well an increase in organic traffic coming from search engines. That's free traffic. In your ads on some platforms, I believe this is on some of Google's AdWords platforms, if your landing page is faster, you get a better quality score. So the efficiency of your marketing spend improves. Your ads effectively get cheaper, so you don't have to bid as much in theory. And then one that often gets glossed over but is important to remember is better brand sentiment. So, you go to a physical store of a high-end, goods maker, and they spend a lot of time obsessing over the quality of the marble, how the floor looks, what the experience is when you walk in the door. And, especially in post-COVID, all those things still apply to the digital experience. They're just, through a browser window. And so you need to also obsess about all of that as well. And how fast that page responds is very much a key part of that. So those are some of the key areas to highlight.
Great. Well, I think that's a great point, that we are all obsessed about fast sites in the modern web and getting ahead. And we are at the top of the hour. So Wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. Check out the rest of the Mock Information Festival sessions. And if you have any questions for the panel, please reach out.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.